Hello, thanks for wandering into the Acoustic Words Reading Room. I'm Stephen Larson. If I were to give this edition a title, it would be Sardonic Humor. We'll begin with a short poem, A Conversation with the Muse. The Muse smacked me upside the head and said, "Write a poem." I said, "You must be joking. I'm no poet." She said, "Did I ask if you were a poet? Write a freaking poem." I said, "Okay. About what?" She said, "That's your problem." I said, "Okay. What form?" She said, "That's your problem too. Write." So I wrote a poem about the Muse asking me to write a poem, and I showed it to her. "Cop out," she snarled, and vanished. The Muse is one mean bitch. A Conversation with the Muse. I actually wrote that when I was wrestling with some other poetry. The short story in this edition is The Last Days of Joanna Broadhurst. Friday, March 16th. The weekend began with an auspicious and well-timed thud when Russell McAllister of New Concepts Advertising, formerly McAllister, Dunleavy, Van Cleve, and Ott, until Dunleavy, Van Cleve, and Ott left to start a Japanese-Norwegian catering service, but that's another story, carefully placed the immaculate rear of his artistically faded $135 ice-washed designer denims on the near corner of Joanna Broadhurst's desk, lit his 1,000 candle power boyishly charming grin, and announced, "The Volosek account is waving little red distress flags as it goes down the toilet." Joanna, who had long ago learned to see the viper behind Russell McAllister's boyishly charming grins, shrugged with a heart that sank as fast as the account. "Russell," she said carefully, "that's precisely where it belongs." Russell shook his head. "Joe, you don't really mean that. I know you don't." Joanna sighed. "You can take compost and make it look like top sirloin, but no matter how nicely you garnish it, it still tastes like something the puppy left on the floor overnight." "Meaning?" "Meaning that the Proteus 2 is a pile of pigeon droppings fit to be driven only to the nearest dump. You're mixing your species, and my metaphors, no doubt. Look, Russell, every automotive reviewer in the country considers the Proteus 2 a running gag, when it runs. Which is why we were hired, to restyle its image. Russell, the car is junk. How do you restyle junk?" "Ah, that's the kind of challenge that makes this more than a job. It's an adventure." He stood. "And the adventure continues tonight." "Russell, I've got Matt coming over. He's cooking me dinner." "I can give you the number of a nice little Japanese-Norwegian catering service. Get your team together before they leave. I need a new concept by Monday. First thing. Eric!" He tossed his grin to the other side of the room and followed it over. Joanna spent about 7 seconds being stunned, then seized the desk phone. "Denny, grab the team. We're pulling a late-nighter. Orders from God." Then she grabbed her cell. When the voicemail picked up, she said, "Matt, it's me. Russell wants the Volosek team to stay over tonight. Let yourself in and keep it warm. I don't know when I'll get in, but I'll make it up to you. Don't bother texting or returning the call. We'll be incommunicado. See you later. Love." When she left the office, it was nearly 11:30, and they hadn't settled on anything. Her apartment was dark and the kitchen untouched. She was too tired to text. Saturday, March 17th. She spent the day in the office with the Volosek team, wrenching out a campaign that wouldn't do too much damage to their ethics and credibility. The highlight of the day came at about 3 in the afternoon when, slightly crazed by a creativity overload and too much caffeine, they all tried to think of other uses for the Proteus 2. The suggestions ranged from a planter for the Ford Museum in Detroit to a target for the White Sands missile range. Her personal favorite was to stuff them with pairs of Russell McAllister's designer denims, load them in cargo planes, and drop them on Syria. She tried several times to text Matt, then tried actually calling him. After the fourth time, she tired of hanging up on his voicemail. Consequently, she didn't know he'd changed his outgoing message until nearly 7, after the team had finally put together a campaign that left them at least a little self-respect. She was hoping to patch things up with a St. Patrick's Day night on the town. She had composed and jotted down a conciliatory speech during their last exhaustion break and was mentally rehearsing it, so she almost didn't notice his new greeting. Almost. "Hello, this is Matt Del Bianco," murmured the silky baritone that had won its owner dozens of lucrative radio and television voiceovers and brought him into her life. "Leave me a message, and I'll get back to you. Unless you're Joanna Broadhurst. Then you needn't bother, because frankly, Joe, I'm tired of it all. I'm tired of being put on hold every time Russell wants you to jump through hoops for him. You're a beautiful woman and dynamite in bed, but I need and deserve a little more than that. Goodbye and good luck, Joe. Everyone else, here's the beep." Joanna was so shocked that Matt could be so classless that she hung up without a word. Then she almost called back to tell him what to do with himself, but that would give him too much. "Got any plans tonight?" "Huh?" She blinked, momentarily disoriented. "Are you going anywhere tonight?" Then he repeated. She flushed, fumbled for words. No, I guess not." "You all right?" "Oh, yeah, I'm fine. What did you have in mind?" Just a few green beers. We're all going out and thought you and Matt might want to come along, unless you guys have other plans." "That slime bag is history." "Well, great. I'm sorry. Does this mean I have a chance?" "Sure." She rose, gathered her purse, her coat, and her composure, and brushed her fingers lightly across his cheek. "Just as soon as Motor Trend names the Proteus 2 Car of the Year." She headed for the door. "Hey, as long as there's hope," Denny called out, then hurried to catch up with her. Sunday, March 18th. Joanna woke with a groan and then spent a few minutes with her eyes closed, restructuring the previous night. It had gotten somewhat misty after the fourth or fifth beer, but she did remember running into Russell McAllister, who had switched ancestry from Scottish to Irish for the evening. She also remembered, a couple of beers later, that Russell had shown the bartender how to make what was it? An emerald isle, a clear, delightfully green, subtly potent mixture of his own creation. He bought them, 2, 3 rounds? And then she remembered thinking how incredibly attractive he really was, and how surprised she was later that he actually wore clothes that hid his lean, muscular... She froze, turned her head carefully, and opened her eyes. The sunlight on the sheets sent pain stabbing through her head, but she hardly noticed, so relieved was she to find herself alone. He had apparently let himself out afterward, unless he was lurking elsewhere in the apartment. She swung her feet over the side of the bed, and a wave of nausea sent her stumbling into the bathroom. She had done more drinking than eating since yesterday's lunch, so very little came up. When she was done and had rinsed her mouth, she stared at herself in the mirror. She had been drunk to sickness before, but this felt somehow different. She carefully walked back to her bedroom, opened the nightstand drawer, and with some hesitancy, withdrew a home pregnancy test she had bought New Year's Day in a moment of false panic. While she waited for the results, Joanna made certain that Russell had indeed left, and then gagged down 3 acetaminophen in the futile hope of subduing the firestorm behind her eyeballs. By the time she was reasonably certain the capsules were going to stay down, the test was finished. She stared at the unmistakable brown ring and felt a momentary fear that Russell was an overachiever outside the office as well. She shook her head, an action she paid for with tears. She must still be a little drunk. It was obviously Matt's. She put 6 CDs of contemplative guitar and piano music on the changer and went back to bed. Monday, March 19th. Joanna walked into New Concepts as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened over the weekend. She was momentarily shaken when she saw the members of the Volosek team. She couldn't remember whether they had parted company before or after she had invited Russell to her place. But even Denny greeted her in his usual manner, so she was able to focus completely on gathering up the Volosek files, walking to Russell McAllister's office, and knocking on the doorframe. "Come," he called. He was sitting at his computer terminal, his back to the door. She waited for him to turn around, then, when he didn't, announced, "The Volosek account." He waved his hand in her direction. On the desk, Joe. Thanks. You were great. Take the day off." Joanna wanted to bludgeon him with his nameplate, but as she had already planned on telling him she was taking the day off, she simply said, "Thank you," through her gritted teeth to the back of his head, and left. It wasn't until she was out of the building and halfway down the street that she realized he couldn't have been speaking of the Volosek account. It took 3 art galleries, lunch at the Russian Tea Room, a new Scarpino hairstyle, and a $4,000 Henri Jules Brissard outfit to calm down, but Joanna decided that it was worth this strain on her bank account. As she walked down the street, she was rewarded with appreciative glances every few yards, punctuated by the occasional frank stare. By the time she was more than halfway to her apartment, she knew she was radiating confidence and self-assurance, and that her whole manner announced to all of Manhattan that she was a force to be reckoned with. And then it began to rain. Not a stray drop here and there, not a sprinkle, not even a light shower, but a downpour, a cold deluge from a cloud that had not yet even touched the late afternoon sun. She ran to the curb to command a cab, but all were suddenly unavailable. 2 minutes later, she, Scarpino, and Henri Jules were all drenched anyway. She turned and splashed the rest of the way home. Tuesday, March 20th. Joanna twisted her ankle on the wet pavement as she entered the Randolph building. She ignored the pain as well as she could and hobbled on into the ground floor coffee shop. "How's it going?" asked Heather as she set Joanna's usual bagel and chamomile tea on the counter. "Don't ask," winced Joanna. Heather nodded. "I know how it is." "Somehow I doubt it." "No, I mean it. Listen, honey, I don't know a whole lot you can go through that me or one of the other girls haven't seen. Oh, our problems aren't as upscale as yours, but hey, if my '88 Chevy gets crunched, it takes as big a chunk out of my salary as your Beamer." "I don't own a car," snapped Joanna. Heather was called away. When she came back, she said, "I'm sorry, Miss Broadhurst. I didn't mean to offend you or suggest you were shallow. I was just saying we're not as different as it looks sometimes." Joanna sighed. "That's all right. I think I understand. Well, there's this song by Switchfoot, you know. It goes, 'This is your life. Are you who you want to be?' I mean, there are lots of times I feel like I should have done something else. Sometimes I think I ought to quit here and follow my dreams, and sometimes I think I ought to just give up and, well, you know. What about you, Miss Broadhurst? You got any dreams?" "Years ago," Joanna mused, "before I graduated, I wanted to live in the Rockies and paint miniature watercolor landscapes. But there was an opening in the art department of a little ad agency, and then one thing led to another until—" She spread her hands. Heather nodded. "I wanted to be an actress on Broadway. I still do. Sometimes that's all that keeps me from, a few extra sleeping pills or whatever." Joanna shook her head. "See, that's where we differ. You can still go out and make your dreams come true. If your life here falls apart, you have an alternative to your pills. I don't. Well, I don't believe that. Everybody's got a way to escape, make their dreams come true, even you. Joanna shrugged. Huh? Maybe, maybe not. I just hope I don't ever have to make that decision. I'm afraid my dreams aren't strong enough. Oh, my lord, she looked at her watch. I'm going to be late. Miss Broadhurst, Heather called out after her. The elevators are out. You'll have to take the stairs. It took Joanna nearly 15 minutes to hobble up to the 12th floor. Her ankle screamed every step of the way. Wednesday, March 21st. Joanna overslept and awoke with a monumental cold to accompany her morning sickness. Her ankle was still stiff and sore, and she feared that the gossip mill had finally gotten wind of last Saturday night's indiscretion. She felt worse than she ever had before, physically and emotionally, and was considering calling in sick when she noticed she had gotten another call. She lay in bed and listened to the latest message. Hello, Joanna. My name's Chris. I heard how Matt dumped you, and I think it sucks. I know how you must be feeling. You sound like someone who deserves much better, and I'd like a chance to show you that not everyone is scum. We could get together tonight at the Lotus Eaters. I have a quiet table on reserve at all times on the upper level by the fountain. Meet me at 7. I really think we'd be good for each other. Joanna sighed. This made, 23 since Saturday. At least the other 22 had been men. This decided it, though. If they were going to begin calling before she even woke up, she'd rather take her chances with Russell. And she would have to go out anyway. It looked like it was time to change carriers. Her phone chimed again, even as she stuffed it in her purse, and she thought, Thanks, Matt. This is another one I owe you. The elevators were still out, and now the gaping shafts exhaled a stale, wet, mildewed odor. The Randolph building was quaint, which, as any good advertising copywriter knew, meant old and falling apart. There were only two elevators at the end of the little hall, and it seemed to take forever to repair them. By the time she reached the top stair, her ankle was throbbing again, and her nose seemed to have gained 15 pounds, much of which was trying to drain through her left nostril. She held a tissue to it almost constantly and was aware of its redness. She hoped it was that, her limp, and her lateness that caused a half-second cessation of work when she walked in. By mid-afternoon, after a trip to the bank on her lunch hour and a brief phone call to set up an appointment at a clinic for April 6th, Joanna felt she had things at least somewhat under control. She was able to accept Denny's disquieting sidelong glances and Russell's occasional leer with complete serenity. Of course, the half-dozen borrowed antibiotics floating about in her system may have had a lot to do with it. Still, whatever the reason, she was actually feeling nearly human when she left the office to visit the 12th floor restroom. It was quite a testimony to at least one of the decongestions that Joanna's first warning came via her nose. She had just identified the smell as insecticide when the drain in the center of the floor began to seethe. She caught sight of it in the mirror, and her eyes widened. Before she could do more than gasp and cover her mouth, the drain boiled over with scores of shiny brown cockroaches. Several generations were being forced up and out of this one forgotten escape hatch by massive fumigation efforts far below. The creatures had clearly had fertile feeding and breeding territory. The smallest was no less than 1.25 inches long, and many were easily twice that. Fascination and disgust rooted Joanna to the floor as she watched wave upon wave scuttle over the tiles in her frantic effort to find safety. She felt as if she had suddenly been dropped onto the set of a horror film. She had never before experienced such concentrated revulsion, and the pure novelty of the situation kept her in place much longer than she would have thought possible. Then they began to fly. That did it. She swatted and ducked, then grabbed her purse and ran, hearing and feeling her shoes crunch. Her stomach convulsed, but she fought back successfully, knowing that the alternative was to return to the toilets. She dashed out of the restroom and down the hall, stopping at the new concept's door to catch her breath and still her trembling. Then she strode in as firmly as she could on her newly throbbing ankle, straightened her desk, gathered her things, informed Russell that she did not feel well, and left. Both elevators gaped wide with ropes across their openings and no promise yet of repair. As the stairway door closed behind her, Joanna could hear a shriek from the bathroom at the other end of the hall. However, she was able to keep a tight grip on her emotions until much later when, in her apartment, she removed tissue from her purse and found 2 of the largest roaches clinging to it. Then she indulged herself in a very satisfying fit of hysterics. Thursday, March 22nd. The day began on a note of hope. The super had agreed to an emergency spraying in her apartment. Something in her voice had warned him not to argue. She had gotten a good deal on a new camera and updated cell phone on her way to work. It was still raining steadily, and that smell from the shafts had grown stronger, but at least one of the elevators was back in operation. And although Denny was still acting a little funny, Russell had finally struck a balance between smirking at her and ignoring her. Even her cold and her twisted ankle had improved. Joanna put in a satisfying day's work. Then, shortly before leaving, she went to the restroom. They had been assured that every little visitor had been mercilessly eradicated and the 12th floor facilities disinfected to hospital standards. But the first time Joanna had stepped through the door, the simple sight of the drain had sent her 1 floor down to accounting. She was now there in one of the stalls when 2 women from the 11th floor came in. Joanna ignored their chatter until one suddenly changed topics. "So, what's this I hear about Russell? Did he really score with Broadhurst upstairs?" "Last Saturday night." "Well, who won the pool?" "Donna in payroll." "Well, that pretty much takes care of all of them up there, doesn't it?" Not quite. There's a new girl in the art department, Deirdre something or other he hasn't done yet. I'm collecting the bets on her." "Well, how old is she?" 29, same as him." "Pretty?" "Knockout." "Has tomorrow been taken?" "All right, what about tonight?" "Okay, put me down for tonight then." Joanna waited a few minutes after they had gone before she left the stall and the restroom. She was furious at them, at Russell, at herself. She spoke to no one as she gathered her purse and coat and left. At the elevator, she waited in silence. Several of her co-workers noticed her staring at the open shaft next to them. When she got to her apartment, the smell of the insecticide finished what the overhead conversation had begun. She barely made it to the kitchen sink before she was violently ill. Then, in her living room, she noticed that her cat had eaten half of her favorite plant, insecticide and all. The plant would survive. The cat hadn't. She spent most of the night crying. Friday, March 23rd. Although Joanna spent the day at her desk, she did little work. Most of the time she spent staring at her drawing table, her mind lost in a miasma of depression and anger. She wanted nothing to do with new concepts or with Russell, the boy genius, and walking hormone. She wanted nothing to do with Matt and his bastard. She wanted nothing to do with Denny and Deirdre and all the rest of the counterfeit humans in the building who should have been destroyed with the rest of the roaches. And she mostly wanted nothing to do with Joanna Broadhurst, fool, laughingstock, desperately old at 35. "Guess what?" said Russell, as he planted his designer posterior on the edge of Joanna's desk, midway between her and the far corner. "The Volosuk account exploded on launch." She stared at him, silent. His grin never faltered. "Yeah, I thought it was brilliant, but their brass thought it was too whimsical or some such crap." She didn't stir. His grin never faltered. So, you're going to have to pull another weekender, Joe. But this time, don't bother calling in the team. I'm going to tackle this one with you. What's the matter? Deirdre didn't give you a tumble last night? Joanna spoke more loudly than she intended, and the muffled hum of the office, which had already softened with Russell's approach, now ceased altogether. Russell's grin, without lessening, chilled several degrees. I beg your pardon? He asked quietly. No, snapped Joanna. You got my sweat, my soul, and, yes, damn you, my body. My pardon you will never get. And I will not work with you tonight or any other night on the Volosik account or any other little project you might have in mind. Well, then you no longer work here at all. He strode back to his office. In the silence, a pencil fell to the carpet somewhere. It made a very loud noise. Joanna emptied her desk. Denny started forward to help, but she waved him back. When she was finished, she looked around and smiled. Several later described a strange chill that accompanied that smile. Then she picked up the small pile of her belongings and walked out the door. That was the last time any of them ever saw her. They found a few of Joanna's possessions a half hour later on the floor just outside the open elevator shaft, but thought little of it. Over the weekend, Denny tried to contact her several times, going to her door in person since she had not yet given out her new cell number. A neighbor finally told him Sunday night that she had not been seen all weekend. So on Monday morning, on a hunch, he took a flashlight to the basement of the Randolph building. Then he called the police. Rumors, of course, spread like the latest disease. What emerged, stripped of speculation, was actually very little. Joanna Broadhurst had vanished, leaving behind everything but her bank account, which had been emptied the previous Wednesday. Investigators turned up an April 6th appointment at an abortion clinic, also made that Wednesday. No one was surprised when the appointment was neither kept nor canceled. They had, after all, found her briefcase, her papers, and everything from her desk piled at the bottom of the elevator shaft. They also found bloodstains on and around the briefcase. That forensic experts had identified the blood as rodent made little difference. That they had found no body made even less. What they did find, in addition to Joanna's property, was a recently opened fissure, a crack just wide enough for a woman to squeeze through, caused apparently by the settling of the building in earth saturated with week-long rains. The crack opened directly into the storm sewer, the source of the odd smell that had been percolating through the building. It also became the source of the popular, albeit unofficial, explanation that Joanna Broadhurst, despondent over the double collapse of her personal life and her career, had thrown herself down the elevator shaft. The fall had injured but not killed her. Disoriented, she had found and squeezed through the fault into the storm sewer, where the floodwaters had drowned her and swept her body into the river, which, in turn, had dumped it into the harbor and eventually into the sea and beyond all human ken. Russell McAllister delivered a beautiful and eloquent eulogy to the staff of New Concepts, praising Joanna's character and abilities with the same deftness and imagery that had won his latest Clio. Then he announced a series of promotions, culminating with Deirdre Clark. His hand on her shoulder would later alert the 11th floor pool that they had a winner. The Volosek team held a wake to which they quietly forgot to invite Russell, and at which Denny was absent. He spoke to no one at New Concepts about Joanna, and no one bothered to ask why he spent a half hour every morning in the basement, or why he quit New Concepts a month later to join the Land of the Midnight Sushi Japanese-Norwegian catering service. And Matt Del Bianco showed up at Joanne's apartment as it was being cleared out to claim several items as his, and then vanished again. For the next 6 months, March 23rd was known in the Randolph building as the day Joanna Broadhurst jumped down the elevator shaft. Then Russell McAllister was named in 3 paternity suits and 7 sexual harassment suits simultaneously. The first anniversary of Joanna's disappearance passed unmarked, although maintenance was startled to discover a single rose lying on the year-old concrete patch at the bottom of one of the elevator shafts. Joanna Broadhurst, however, has not been entirely forgotten. A postcard addressed simply to Heather in the Randolph Building coffee shop arrived about 18 months after Joanna's disappearance. Devoid of any written message or return address beyond a Colorado postmark, the back is beautifully hand-painted in soft pastel watercolors and shows a tiny baby reaching wide-eyed for a wildflower in a mountain meadow. Below are the words, "This is your life. Are you who you want to be?" Heather has posted it on the board in the kitchen. On particularly hectic days, when hopes and aspirations lie crushed and mangled in the streets, Heather and the other waitresses look at that little piece of a dream, and they smile. And somehow, the day doesn't seem quite so bad anymore. And that was the last days of Joanna Broadhurst. Thank you for joining me in the Acoustic Words reading room. For more information on how to purchase individual electronic downloads of the short stories, how to purchase both the entire collection of the short stories and poetry in electronic version and in a paperback version, and how to purchase copies of 2 other novels that I've written, The Eros Variations and Mind Games, visit me at stephenmlarson.com. There's a link in the About section of my YouTube page here. There's more than one link. There's a link to my webpage. There's also a link to a SoundCloud page where I have performances of the music that I've written. There's also a link to my Facebook Acoustic Words page. Thank you for visiting. Please come back soon, and have a good life.